Good evening, everyone. We're going to take just 1 minute to get people admitted, and we will start our program. Thanks so much. Okay, Elizabeth, do you think it's okay to start? Just with greetings and
Yeah, go ahead.
great, thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Lynn Edmonds. I am Outreach Director for Public Schools First NC, and welcome to the Cost of Disruption, our first of our webinar series for 2025. With us tonight, we've got two panelists and actually three. So Dr. Rachel White is with us. Now, come on, advance. There we go. And Dr. White is an associate professor at the College of Education at the University of Texas in Austin, and a researcher, an author, and a former school board member. And joining us, she's going to go first. Joining us a little bit later is Dr. Rebecca Jacobsen, and I'll let her introduce herself when her time comes. And then we also have with us a school board member, Judy Justice from New Hanover County. And I have a bio slide and headshot for her as well, but we'll hold off on that for when she presents. And Dr. White is going to be talking about her research around the cost of conflict. And because we've got three panelists, we are going to have intermittent time for questions and conversation after each panelist. We are going to get right to it because we've got a full agenda, and we're not going to let any time go to waste. So thank you for being here. Before I forget to say, we are recording this, and it will be available on our YouTube channel within a day or two. So we will be sending that link and a link to this report. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and welcome Dr. White. Thank you so much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Lynn. Let me try to get my screen shared appropriately, quickly. Okay. Everyone can see this okay? I can only see Dr. Jacobsen, and I think she nodded yes, so hopefully that's good. So good to be with you all. As Lynn said in my introduction, I'm Dr. Rachel White. I'm an associate professor here at University of Texas at Austin, and just really delighted to share this research with you all, and that you all showed interest in this work. This is work that was conducted in collaboration with a team sort of across the US. So me down here in Texas, Dr. John Rogers at UCLA, Dr. Joseph Kahn at UC Riverside, and Dr. Robert Shand at American University on the East Coast. And so I'm just going to try to quickly share what we found. I'm going to share a little bit about the way that we did the research, but I'll put a QR code up at the end that will link to the report, and there's much more detail in there around the methods and things like that. So happy to answer questions about that, and or feel free to view the report. Okay, so just gonna do a quick laying of context. I don't think I really need to do that for this audience, but as many of you know, public schools, particularly in the last 5-ish years, have been experiencing a lot of political conflict. And it's a sort of unique political conflict that tends to be really focused around what we call culturally divisive issues. And I'm gonna explain a little bit about what that means, but we're just seeing more and more of that happening. For me, I run something called the Superintendent Lab, and I work on a daily basis with superintendents and superintendent organizations. And what I have noticed really since 2019 is just this continuous change in that profession where the superintendents are feeling more and more like they're having to really be focused on navigating politics and leading through political conflict, than really focused on curriculum and instruction, organizational, growth and things like that, really focus things on, student learning. And so it was sort of the changes that I've seen over the past 5 years that really made me interested in being part of this project, to try to better understand what is truly the cost of this culturally divisive conflict, both on school districts and their bottom line, their funding, and how they're spending their money, but also on superintendents as human beings, like what is the cost to them. So what I'm going to share tonight is just a little bit about, one, the extent to which districts, boards, and superintendents are experiencing divisive conflict. Two, what is the actual financial price tag for the cost to school districts, and then the personal price tag for superintendents, and then sort of end it maybe talking about a little bit of the importance of school board superintendent relations, and hopefully that'll lead into some of Dr. Jacobsen's work. So the data that we used for this was a national survey conducted from the superintendent lab that has a national database of school superintendents. We did the survey between May and August of 2024, and we had sort of 3 key sections. One was on the nature of conflict related to culturally divisive issues. So we were asking things like, how frequently was the conflict happening? Who was sort of starting the conflict? Who is the conflict toward? And what sort of spaces? Asking about the frequency and topics associated with personal or professional threats that emanated from the conflict, and then the financial and human resources that were the costs of the conflict. Just real quickly, so you can get a sense of the survey, it was we were very excited. We had a little over 600 responses nationwide, and very, very similar. Our sample population here on the left, the blue population here on the right, very, very similar to what we see at the national level in terms of gender and race. And then we did see that we had a slight underrepresentation of rural superintendent respondents and slight overrepresentation of suburban superintendent respondents. That was a little not really that surprising because in some other work that I'm doing, one of the findings was that suburban superintendents were significantly more likely to report experiencing culturally divisive conflict. So they may have seen the survey and been more likely to say, yes, let me take this and have my voice heard. I will just note that the broader study does include interviews with 42 superintendents across 12 states. And in the full report, we have, I think, 4 or 5 vignettes that really dive in to some of the details around the culturally divisive conflict that superintendents are experiencing. So really briefly, we did the national survey and we asked questions related to whether and how often districts have been challenged by things like banning books, dealing with misinformation, policies that are protecting LGBTQ students. And we are asking how frequently they were experiencing those, from never to weekly or more often. We also were trying to get at more heightened forms of conflict, meaning violence. So those scores, we sort of added all of these elements up together to create a conflict score. We gave the scores very similar numbers across all of these things, but when we did the scores down here, we gave greater weight if a superintendent actually was experiencing hostile or violent rhetoric, was fearing for their safety, or if they had a threat to their life. So if you can imagine, we had all these questions, we sort of gave each response a number, added it all up. And what we found is that there are almost all districts are experiencing some sort of conflict. So you can see here, over here, some districts were experiencing, 30 to a score of 30 to 40. You can see there were a few districts that reported 0, but almost every district was reporting at least some level of conflict. The green being the lower levels, the red being the upper levels. So just kind of give you a sense of the distribution of the responses. This is a graph that sort of shows you the extent of conflict that districts are experiencing by the topic. I'm just going to point out a couple of things. You can see here that things like social emotional learning, school safety and security, LGBTQ plus issues and financial decision-making tended to be the top ones that people were talking about in terms of experiencing conflict related to them. On the right-hand side, you see S's and C's. That means that suburban and city districts were significantly more likely to report experiencing conflict in that area. So for example, for the one in the middle, school safety and security, suburban and city superintendents were significantly more likely to be experiencing conflict related to that topic. We also found that in the 23-24 school year, about 95% of school districts had parents and community members spreading misleading, inaccurate, or false information about district policies and practices. About almost a quarter of them said that that was happening on a weekly basis or more often. And then we asked them how often that people contacted the school or district to raise issues or parent concerns related to these same things, sort of SEL, access to books, teaching race and racism. And I want to point out that the dark color, we asked who was raising these issues, parents and community members that actually lived in the community, or individuals, elected officials, or organizations that are from outside of the district. And I just want to point out two quick things. One, this light color here is, you can see that for things like SEL, policies related to LGBTQ student rights, and teaching about controversial social and policy issues, those ones had much more parent and community member engagement. But then you see things like teaching race and racism, and it doesn't seem super high, but when it was occurring weekly or more in districts, it was more often occurring by individuals and organizations outside of the district coming in and bringing those issues to light. Okay, we then asked about the impact of conflict related to culturally divisive issues, the non-financial impact. And so one of the things here that we found quite interesting is the very negative or slightly negative effect that this conflict is having right here on staff stress or mental health challenges. So over 50% of superintendents reported that it's had a really negative effect on staff stress and mental health, but also on student stress or mental health. This next column right to the right, over 50% said that this has really had an impact on student stress and mental health. And then the other thing I want to share is that we actually costed out the price of conflict. And so we asked superintendents questions about how much money they were spending above and beyond what they typically would spend on things like security, media, legal cases, community relations, school board relations, those types of things. And so we asked them, how much additional dollars are you spending on these things because in response to culturally divisive conflict? So that would be direct costs. And then we also asked them about indirect costs. So indirect costs are things like time and the loss of staff. And so we asked them, how many more hours did you spend than normal on things like legal cases related to, let's say, book banning issues or something like that. So we asked them about indirect costs like time, and then we costed that out using the national average salary of a superintendent and what the hourly rate would turn out to. So we costed that indirect cost. And then we asked them questions around if they knew of any staff, teachers, principals, or other staff that left the district, left education potentially, because specifically of something related to culturally divisive conflict. So that went into our indirect costs as well. So for the districts that had high conflict, so if you look back at that green, yellow, red distribution, the ones that were in the red that had really high conflict, you can see that the largest cost was legal costs, costing around $56,000 a year more than what they normally would. Second highest cost being security, around $40,000 a year. You can see the costs kind of go down, but even in low conflict districts, we're spending a significant amount of money still on things like security and legal. When we added all of the costs up across the nation and extrapolated that, the total cost that we found, both direct and indirect, and the costs that are incorporated when staff turnover, to be $3.2 billion in the 2023-24 school year. And then a couple other things I just want to share. We asked in relation to the culturally divisive conflict, how often school board meetings were characterized by hostile or violent rhetoric. We saw that about 45% of districts reported that at least one time they had hostile or violent rhetoric at their school board meeting, with about 17% saying that it occurred on a monthly basis. And then specifically for superintendents, we asked them if any of these things had happened to them in the last school year related to culturally divisive conflict. So we found about 50% of superintendents across the US reported that they were harassed or that they saw disrespectful images or comments of themselves online at some point last year. About 10% of superintendents had at least one instance of stalking or threats of personal violence or property vandalism. We've had some folks say, well, 10% is not really that much, right? And my response is always anything above 0 for any of these is unacceptable. And then we also asked them how frequently the superintendents felt fearful about their own safety or the safety of their family. And about a third of superintendents said that they at some point last year did fear for their safety or the safety of their family. And so just a couple of points of discussion that I'm thinking about now is sort of how can this data and research help efforts to really improve? I think at this point in time, we really need to double down and improve on sort of superintendent stability in districts, because we need really strong leaders at the top that can help us work through this. And how can we sort of also improve their capacity and willingness to engage in policy spaces and navigate this political contention? I'm trying to think about what additional information and data would be helpful to collect to sort of, think of ways that we can try to create more civil conversation in these communities. And so how do we create sort of trusting spaces where people feel vulnerable to be able to have these conversations that can then help inform the field as we move forward. Okay, and I think that's everything. I think this is a link directly to the lab actually, but hopefully folks, Lynn and Yvonne, I'll share with you the link to the full report if people want to read the full report. It's very brief, I think only 9 pages or something like that with the vignettes.
Rachel, thank you so much. So for our attendees, we know that was a lot and super, super fast. I really appreciate that, Dr. White. Thank you for helping us keep this moving along. And again, audience members, we will share this information with you, and as well as a link to the report. So Rachel, while Yvonne is going to check and see if we've got questions in the chat, and we welcome our audience to participate that way, I wanted to know if you talked to your superintendents about the loss of teachers and school librarians specifically. And if you talked about other data that you might want to collect, have you thought about taking that as the next step? Because in my mind, I see those teachers and with parents wanting to inspect curriculum, classroom materials, every piece of, classroom libraries, and certainly the media center, the school libraries. I see them as the next targeted individuals, if you will, in addition to the superintendents.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We did not ask about specific positions, like the specificity of who left. And so, I think from other research that has been going on around the book banning, that can hopefully provide some context. And I really hope someone is studying the extent to which, media specialists and librarians in K-12 public schools are feeling this. But that is not something that we specifically asked within the survey. So we don't have that data, but it is, I think, something that we definitely need to be tracking.
Sure. And do you still have all of the superintendents that were participated? Are they still superintendents to your knowledge?
Oh, that's a good question. I do have the data, but I didn't actually look at what percent turned over from this survey specifically. But that is something that I can look at. We did just get with the superintendent lab. We do update superintendent turnover on a national level every year. And we just finished up data collection for 24-25. And superintendent turnover was around a little over 17% nationwide. If you go back to 2019, superintendent turnover was around 14%. And so it's been increasing at a pretty steady rate over the last 5 years. And then we also track superintendent turnover that's associated with political contention or contentious environments. And we're seeing that has also just continued to increase. So there's been some real ramifications for superintendents. And we just know that has a really potential detrimental impact on the district as a system in terms of the culture that they're trying to create. And when you have this system of churn of superintendents getting hired and then being fired for something like this, it can be really challenging for the educators within the system, but also the families and the students who have come to trust that superintendent.
Definitely. So I did not mention this when I introduced myself, but I am also a school board member in Wake County, North Carolina. And I really, and plus I was a parent, and both of my adult children went K-12 through the Wake County public schools. And I know, all of us or most of us on this, hopefully all of us on this webinar tonight appreciate the gravity and the weight and the importance of a good, strong leader at the superintendent level. And what's interesting to me or saddens me is that these are very high stress jobs anyway, prior to pandemics, prior to culture wars, prior to the erosion of trust in our public schools and attacks on our public schools that we see today. So one can only assume that it would worsen the pipeline and worsen the turnover rate. So Yvonne has a question that says, I don't know if you can see the chat. It says, did the superintendents report any patterns or changes in the threats or conflict? In other words, do they seem to be getting worse over time, or are they easing off?
Yeah, great question. I want to respond really quickly, Lynn, to your comment and just say, I was at a convening of superintendents last week, and then teaching a whole group of aspiring superintendents this week. And in both contexts, there's this sentiment right now that this is the feeling of stress and just like they know that they're going to get burnt out is the closest that they felt since COVID. The COVID-19 pandemic is what sort of they likened it to, is that just constant sense of trying to figure something out trying to figure a problem out that they've never had to figure out before. And so I know right now there's just an immense amount of pressure and stress on superintendents and principals and teachers and families. But I just know last week, I don't know if you all had been following the movement at the federal level on some of the executive orders and the Dear Colleague level letters. It's, I think in some cases, some of this political context has been imposed from national and sort of broader groups. But it's still what people were feeling was a little bit more localized. And I think in the last week, people have really are on edge because of the things that are happening. To respond to Yvonne's question, if you read the vignettes in the report, this isn't a longitudinal study. I would love to keep doing this every year and kind of see how it changes over time. But you can see in the vignettes, for example, one of the superintendents talked about, not one, I think actually all of them in the vignettes talked about how this is the most challenging time in their entire career. That it has just continued to get worse and worse, and that the misinformation and the disinformation is one of the most challenging parts of this. And then I will share, it's not just, it's getting worse for the superintendents, but other central office administrators. In one of the vignettes, a superintendent reported a 200% increase among his administrators in the use of psychotropic drugs for things like stress and anxiety. And so I think, things do seem to be getting worse. And I can acknowledge that, like, I think as a nation, we have been more accepting of getting care for things like stress and anxiety. And so maybe that may be contributing to some of this, is some people may be more willing to go seek out care for it. But at the same time, I don't think like the stat is something that we can ignore, that there's been this huge increase in the need for medication to cope with the amount of stress and anxiety that leaders are experiencing in public schools right now.
Thank you. So I know that you need to take off soon, and we are going to switch over to Dr. Jacobsen. Let me just share just for a second, and please feel free to say hello. So audience members, you didn't hear this, but Dr. White and Dr. Jacobsen know each other and have worked together. So feel free to say hi before you have to go.
I'm going to put in the chat the link to the report. I don't know if the audience will see it, but if someone else wants to take that link, they can share it out with the group.
Yes, thank you. So Dr. Jacobsen, thank you for being with us. And I'll let you introduce yourself. So I will say welcome. And again, thank you. And you are the Director of Education Policy, the PhD program at Columbia University, and also a researcher and author. And anything else you would like to say about yourself, please do. And what I'll do is stop sharing my screen, and you should have the ability to start with your presentation and share your slides.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me and for having me join Rachel. Yes, I've known Rachel for a long time, and I'm just thrilled to be alongside her again. And I think that the work she's done is so wonderful and complementary to what I'm going to share. So I'm excited to share this with you. So I'm going to talk about the politics of what I call the politics of disruption. Some of what you're going to hear really overlaps with what Rachel said, but my goal in the research I did was to try to really understand what happened and what are some of the factors that created the situation that some districts found themselves in, and what did it exactly look like in places where different things were happening. So to start us off, the politics of disruption term actually comes from Moms for Liberty themselves. That they are a group that my research focused heavily on. They are not the only group, but they certainly were sort of the most visible, widely discussed group. And so here, Tiffany Justice, who was one of the co-founders, said, you know what I know from working in a school district for 4 years? The administration doesn't like disruption. The establishment doesn't like disruption. That's why you should want it more. So we took that term and tried to understand what was going on and think of the politics of disruption this way. So first, I think it's really important to point out, as Dr. White did, the role of misinformation. So we really call what we were seeing a conspiracy theory, because a conspiracy theory alleges that there are actors that are coordinating in secret, and that they're trying to achieve something that is people should know about, but it's not known by the public. And that secret part is something that I'm going to come back to. And I think it's really critical, because this is not the only time that we have seen civil disobedience or we have seen parents protest. And in many cases, those parents' protests have led to improvements. We've wanted to see more people included. We've wanted to see students have equal opportunities. But this is fundamentally different, in part because it's built on this conspiracy theory. But what did this theory do? Well, it was very effective at motivating people. So it really played on people's fears. It activated their worry. It activated their sense of danger, that there was an immediate threat. And so not only did that happen, but because they had been told that this was a secret and you can't trust your leaders, it really led these new actors that were participating in school board meetings to question the legitimacy of school leaders and educators. And that really led to, when you begin to sort of not buy into the system, not buy into the fact that the people there are trying to do their best, you see this breakdown of institutional norms and processes. We saw lots of anger, insults, threats, and the development of this us versus them rhetoric that is far more common at the national level. Ultimately, what does this lead to? As you already mentioned, Lynn, thank you, trust has really declined. And we think that that trust is particularly important to pay attention to, because once that trust is broken, you're less likely to invest in the institution. You may be willing to see very sweeping, radical change to the institution. And it really opens up the possibility, as more and more people begin to question whether or not we can trust, whether or not we can believe in this institution and the people that are running it. So what did we do? Well, we actually wanted to know what did school boards look like where this happened. So we actually watched school board meetings in 15 school districts. We looked at 3 different time periods. First, we looked in 2019 before COVID to kind of get a sense of like, what was school board politics like before? Then we looked at the contentious period where the fights were really happening. And then we looked at the post-election period. So what happened when new school board members who had run on these divisive issues were elected? We looked at least 3 videos from each of these time periods. In total, we watched more than 400 hours of video. You all are on school boards. These are not the most exciting hours of TV watching ever, but they were really informative as we looked for these key things. We looked at who was speaking and how they identified their relationship to the district. We looked at sort of their tone and style of engagement and whether or not they were abiding by the rules and norms that had been set out. And then we looked at the institutional response. So how did school boards try to manage this disruption? So what kinds of rules and procedures did they use, or did they implement new? So these are our 15 cases. You can see we've got a reasonable variety. We looked at places where Moms for Liberty had been particularly relevant. So they had endorsed candidates. In some of our cases, the dark purple pins, those are places where the Moms for Liberty candidates obtained a majority of the board members. In the blue pins, those are places where Moms for Liberty endorsed candidates were a minority on the board. We then had 6 orange cases. We call these our nationalized issues. Moms for Liberty was not present. There was no activity by that group in the particular school district or in the election. Nonetheless, these same issues were coming up. And then we did 3 counter cases. So the green places are right next to one of our cases where neither of these things happen. So we wanted to know, how are these places different? So first thing is that this conspiracy theory was really effective at getting new people to turn out. So you can see there was pretty tremendous increase in engagement, that the average number of speakers went from about 6 to about 17. The sharpest increase from the pre-period to the contentious period was in the Moms for Liberty minority cases, and it really increased in the Moms for Liberty majority cases, in part because in that post period when the Doom board members took over, they passed some very sweeping, very drastic actions. So they passed a lot of bans, they passed some book bans. 2 of the districts fired their superintendent without cause. And so that really caused groups to continue to turn out even into the post period, creating this sort of us versus them dynamic. Another piece that we found really interesting was that in the pre-period, most people said, I'm a parent, or they said, I'm a community member, and that was it. Well, parents and community members continue to identify themselves. In the contentious period, you begin to see them also saying, I am a member of. So rather than being a community member, they are a member of a group that often had political leanings. So furthering the sort of us versus them dynamic, which was sometimes visible in the meetings. You would see people with different colored shirts on opposite sides of the school board meeting. You would see people with different masks that said different things in different corners of the room. People were holding up signs that identified who they were with and which side they were on. And this, did not return back to the pre-levels. This was something that, continued, though smaller, but we think it's still really important that people are thinking of themselves as part of a group rather than as a member of the community as a whole. So how did these new people that were joining change sort of the tone and interactions that were going on? So negativity is part of a school board meeting. Lynn said she's on a school board. I know Miss Justice is on the school board. Parents complaining or people complaining, that's part of a public hearing, right? Tell us what you think. And sometimes what they think is that they don't like what we're doing. But we saw even an increase in the amount of negativity. So about half of the comments in the pre-period were negative, whereas in the contentious period, it was 2/3 of the comments. Not only was the proportion of negativity increasing, the total number of comments increased. So this meant that sometimes there was literally hours of these negative comments, just one after the next, that were really, I can imagine, difficult to sit through, and they were difficult to watch. While this does dip back down in the post period, it doesn't return to where it was. And this is an important lasting effect. This, again, negativity, lack of trust that continued to exist in these environments. The other thing that we noticed, and Dr. White alluded to this as well, is the picking up of a national narrative, but using it in the local context. So we saw speakers using some of the exact same language that was used by national politicians or national leaders of this ban CRT conspiracy theory. So in 9 of our 15 cases, a public speaker called CRT Marxist. In a third of the cases, the exact phrase that CRT teaches kids to see themselves as either the oppressed or the oppressors was used. We also saw speakers using unsubstantiated claims that were circulating in social media. Things like, in this one case, a speaker said that there's evidence in this district that they may be assisting students with obtaining hormone therapy, potentially without parental consent. And I, having been a teacher, just know how you can't even give a kid an aspirin. So, this is just crazy to think that this is happening, and yet this is the complaint, and without any sort of local context, local concern, it's just, I've heard. And what's important is that when Moms for Liberty wasn't present or these issues weren't present, we never saw this in our comparison cases. So it does seem important to have this, something that triggers this, but then it's really hard to roll that back. Just like Dr. White said, we watched a lot of anger, insults, and threats happen. So it went from about 1.6 in the pre-period to 5 times per meeting. And we tracked this by looking at yelling, at people pounding their fist on the podium when they were speaking, saying how angry they were. And then, oftentimes this anger bled into threats. So sometimes it was a political threat, I'm going to vote you out of office, or I'm going to recall you. But the threats also moved into the personal realm. And I think that is particularly important, especially when it was around LGBTQ board members who their own identity was used as a personal threat against them. This was steepest in Moms for Liberty majority cases, where it ended up getting to, almost 16 times per meeting that there would be these insults, threats, and anger. Here's some examples of the language that we were hearing. So one place where Moms for Liberty held a minority on the board, the speaker, who was wearing a Moms for Liberty t-shirt, said, "Arrogant, incompetent, disingenuous, superior, discriminatory, apathetic. These are just a few words that come to mind when I think of this board." The next example gets even a little bit more inflammatory when a former military member says that I'm going to come for you politically and financially, and actually threatens to organize a boycott of the board member's business in town. He justified these threats, stating that he had sworn an oath to protect this country from all enemies, foreign and domestic. You harm our children, you become a domestic enemy. So this is moving into this realm of viewing the people who you disagree with as being, an enemy, somebody you cannot work with, somebody you cannot find consensus with, because they are so harming children. There is no working with them. As I mentioned before, this increased division was evidenced visually. It also happened in terms of just the civil respect for hearing different opinions. So in 13 out of 15 of our cases, we observed booing and clapping, obviously booing if you disagree, clapping if you agree. And despite the fact that board chairs tried over and over again to tell the audience that this was not acceptable behavior, it would not be tolerated, it just kept happening. And so much so that board members tried to explain to the audience like why this was problematic. As this particular board member said, what I want to avoid is having half of our boardroom clapping for myself or the returning board members, and the other half clapping for two of our newly elected board members. That is not healthy for our community. And I think that this rise of sort of a polarized effect in public education is really new, especially at the local level, where a lot of times, if anything, people were criticized for being too collaborative, for being too pragmatic and cooperative in their decision making. Now we seem to have gone to the other extreme where we've divided people into us and them, good and evil. Because, as I mentioned, this conspiracy theory told people that something was being hidden, that you can't trust your leaders, people began to not respect the rules that go along that those leaders were setting. And so one of the biggest things we saw was people refusing to stop speaking. And this happened in one particular meeting where Moms for Liberty held a minority on the board. 22 people spoke and refused to stop speaking. So even after the microphones were shut off, people would continue to yell their comments, and people had to be approached by police to be physically removed because they refused to stop speaking. So how does the board possibly try to, respond to this and navigate this? And I think it makes a lot of sense what the board did. I can certainly imagine and empathize that in this situation, I would do exactly the same thing. And what we saw was an increasingly restrictive public communication environment. So time limits were increasingly added, sometimes as short as 1 minute. The use of these large timers that would be red and would start blinking at you when you were getting close to your time being up. Sometimes capping the total time that was allowed for public comment, creating new procedures to sign up in advance, or having some sort of one district even try a lottery of who would be able to speak, allowing only one member from each organization to speak. And what we saw in the pre-period was more of this conversational, informal tone with the audience of like, does anybody have something they'd like to say? Like quite literally, that's how comment periods would start. We then saw these long, lengthy 300-word statements that school board chairs or presidents would read about what are the rules, how are they going to be followed, what are the legal issues about public comment period in the state, and what's going to happen if you do not participate in an appropriate way. And as boards began to tighten up to try to regain some civil norms, they became very rigid in the enforcement. Unfortunately, what this fueled was the narrative that, school boards aren't listening. It unfortunately fed right into the rhetoric that was coming about school boards not caring about what parents think, not listening to community members, and having their own agenda. Lastly, police was probably the most extreme form. We've got one image here from the videos that we watched where police were visible in 50% of the Moms for Liberty minority districts and 42% of the Moms for Liberty majority districts. This is one good thing that seems to have dropped back to where it was in the pre-time, but it certainly left a lasting impression when you have this kind of experience in your local community. So, ultimately, we think this leads to the breakdown of institutional trust. And while a lot of work has thought about what's happening at the national level, less work has focused on the local level. And the other thing is that we've often, I think, overemphasized the role of electoral politics. who is elected really matters. I think school board members, who you are, matters. But unfortunately, the politics of disruption does not require winning elections. We actually saw that the conspiracy theory shaped institutional rules and the agenda, even in places where there was no formal national group. Moms for Liberty did not exist. And even in places where counter mobilization limited the number of seats that a group was able to win, it still led to this disruption. So we think that what's important is that this loss of trust really creates the opening for radical change, which some may say is a good thing, but also, changes are not always positive. And it may actually lead to the abandonment of this institution that we have for the last 100 years really continued to work and make progress at in terms of making it open and available to all. And I worry that we're at an inflection point where we may be willing to step back from that public commitment that we've had.
Thank you, Dr. Jacobsen. I share that concern at Public Schools First NC. We really track a lot of this from the viewpoint that the goal is the erosion of public goods and services. It is the destruction of public education, and that's the goal behind a lot of these efforts and a lot of this disruption. For the benefit of privatizers, billionaires, people with all sorts of agendas. And that really is unfortunate, because in our view, public education is the cornerstone of our democracy. So thank you for sharing all of that. I'm going to see what questions we have in the chat. So it looks like I don't see anything from your presentation. There's a few questions left over from Dr. White's presentation. Yvonne, did you have any questions? Can I put you on the spot before we transition over to Judy?
One of the things that's been popping up is that people are really frustrated about how to take your advice and take the advice of Dr. White, and how do we end disruptive behaviors, and like, okay, we understand the impact, but how do we get Moms of Liberty to do the opposite, right? Like, just recently, a school board member, excuse me, a school board meeting, a Mom from Liberty person introduced herself as from Moms for Liberty, and then proceeded to say things that were not true. So, the school board doesn't respond to public comments. They don't do that. It's not their process. But what can parents, PTA members, what can we do?
Yeah, so I think this is a really tough question, but a really important one. So I don't know that I have the full answer, but I've got a couple of thoughts. One is you mentioned at the end of your question that you don't respond. That's actually not what we saw in all of our videos. We actually saw some places where the superintendent or school board members would directly respond at the very end of the meeting, not as a back and forth dialogue, but at the very end of the meeting would take some time to actually address the points and offer the chance to do a follow-up. Well, that may not resolve, especially for somebody who's come in with a particular agenda. I do think that is an important piece to think about in terms of what it communicates to the rest of the room. Your willingness to say, I heard this, here's my initial thoughts on it, I'd love to follow up. That was something that we actually saw in some of our counter cases where there was less contention. It's one thought. Another one was that we saw districts leadership really grappling with how to reach community members. So districts tend to be really good at communicating with parents, but how do we reach the broader community when you no longer have a child directly enrolled? That's often the email list that we have is from parents. So I think trying to figure out ways to further engage the community is really important. And one of the first things that unfortunately disappeared both with COVID and then with this terrible contention was the presence of students and demonstrating student learning at school board meetings. So a number of the meetings we watched started in the pre-period, often with first graders telling what they've learned about a fairy tale unit that they've done, or a video of the basketball team that is inclusive of students with disabilities and the winning shot made by the student with the disability, and how that was such a tremendous success of everybody coming together and rallying with the student, and, you know, having these moments, and and having the student explain that. And I think it makes sense to me why people no longer brought their kids or use these examples. But I think the more we can show and not just tell what we do, I think that's a really important component. And figuring out how we do that for the people who don't show up, how do we communicate that information? You know, it's an unfortunate cost, but I think maybe sometimes investing in a PR campaign, not just slogans, but really, how do we demonstrate the full use of our schools, all the things that we're doing on the weekends, for you know, when we're going into community organizations, the food pantries, the, you know, donations to the Toys for Tots drive, the, you know, visiting local homes for the elderly and reading with them, like all the things that schools do. We have to figure out how to get that to everybody in the community. And that's not something we've always been good at as school districts. So
Okay,
it's helpful at all.
Storytelling. I mean, that's so key in all kinds of campaigns, right? If it's a political campaign, they tell you as a candidate to tell your story, to make it personal. And the same is true for our public schools. We need parents and educators and PTAs and students to tell their stories. It's just hard to break through a lot of the noise, I think.
Gina Davis has raised her hand, but Gina, could you put your question in the Q&A thing, or if you can, or in the meantime, while she's working on that, one of the questions is, we've just lost our second high school superintendent. That's 2 in 5 years. Did you see distrust and issues of this magnitude 15 years ago? It seems to be driven by some of our political leaders. What are your thoughts on this? What is your research showing you?
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that we've had a lot of very tough battles in our schools, partially because they're really important, right? They're our largest public institution. They are our largest local expenditure. Often they're our largest state expenditure. They are the institution that touches more families than any other institution. And because of that, we've fought some very fierce political battles. I think what's different is that today's battle is polarized politically. And so, you know, I think recognizing the influence of the national political polarization is really important, because schools have been the holdout where this hasn't happened, right? We've lost trust in other institutions, and yet people have said they really like their local schools. Parents still really like their local schools. How can we get parents of a wide variety to share how they really feel about their public schools? Because parents are still quite happy with their kids' public schools. And so I think recognizing that this is a political fight, and figuring out how do we work across those differences. I'm not saying this is easy, but I do think it's different than how we've had battles before that have often broken down along lines of race or along lines of religion, like around teaching of evolution or sex education or desegregation. Those things have been very divisive also, but they've broken down different lines than they do today.
I'm going to let I'm trying to find Jenna here. I've lost her, and I'm going to let this be the last question, but I don't want to leave without letting her have a chance to, and I've lost her on the.
I see a note from Jenna Davis. Is
Okay,
that,
you do see Jenna?
I see a comment that she typed in. The only other thought I have, and, you know, Rachel, jump in and stop me too, please, is it is hard to anticipate all of this, but there is, it's been shown that it's really hard once somebody has heard these things to roll that back. And so getting out ahead of it and what they call pre-bunking rather than trying to debunk something can be really important, which is why I again go back to this idea of the more we can get out in the community and show what we're doing, like give away tickets to the spring concert, give away tickets to the spelling bee. Like the more we can get people in our doors to see what we're doing before they hear this stuff, the more likely they are to say, no, that's not what I saw, right? But it's going to take a public relations campaign and us getting out there. And I know, like, who needs one more thing to do? But if we can get, a committee who makes that their priority, maybe we can begin to chip away and sort of shore up against this influence that comes in from outside.
Excellent.
Thank you, Dr. Jacobsen, and thank you, Yvonne, for helping monitor those questions. We are so lucky, so fortunate to have with us a school board member from New Hanover County. I know that I cut off a little bit of North Carolina's map because I was trying to show the viewers where New Hanover County is. They have a really interesting story about their journey, in the pandemic and post-pandemic with the makeup of their board and how they were impacted with the culture wars. And I'm so honored and thrilled that Judy Justice was able to join us tonight. And I am going to turn it over to her. Judy, we just would love for you to tell your story. And if you could give us a little bit of context about what happened in New Hanover in recent years. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, wow. I guess you could say we were at ground zero for what's going on right now across the nation. I'm from the area. I lived in New Hanover County. I left and I came back. I was an educator, over 30 years experience. And when I came back 2016 to the area to retire, I saw that the same school board members were on there that had been there since the 1990s. So I decided to run because I love education. That's my passion. That's my avocation. I got on the school board. It wasn't an easy 4 years. We had some things totally unrelated to politics happen with the sexual assault scandal that was devastating to the district. And so we as a board, there was 7 of us, were dealing with that trauma when COVID hit. We had just lost a superintendent because of these, I guess you could say, scandal. And so we had a new superintendent. There were a lot of people in the public that were already paying attention to our school board happenings because of the scandal. And then when COVID hit, I don't know how else to put it, but the local political right-wing party decided to take advantage of it and undermine our public schools. Moms for Liberty were one of the main groups that jumped right in there with all the distortions and out and out lies. It definitely activated their base. And so we had a pretty healthy call to audience before that because of what had been going on in the district. Things had been calming down when COVID hit. And then we went up to, oh my gosh, anywhere from 20 to 40 people trying to participate. We did have to go to a lottery. We did have to restrict the time limits to cut back on that. We wanted to listen to the public because I actually love the public talking to us. This is how we get good feedback and great ideas normally. Under these circumstances, it was very disruptive. We even had the Proud Boys come in as a group, stand and stare at us and our meetings too ended up going for hours and hours longer than they should have, staring at us during the whole time in their regalia. They were complaining about the group that were coming in. I was called a communist, a leftist, a socialist, a Marxist. I and other board members, I was a known Democrat. So I was attacked. And the main thing was we weren't opening the schools up. We weren't taking the masks off the children, this, that, and the other, and a lot of lies about what was going on. that we that we had to deal with on a monthly basis, and it was really hard to get a lot of really important work done. And this has been the most frustrating part of this whole situation, is the fact that it's almost impossible. It had been at times over the next couple of years to get good work done. In fact, because I had been on the board, had a target on my back. During the election in 2022, they went after me big time. And they had 4 people running that were, was it 4? Yes, that were all, the Moms for Liberty were supporting them, and they had been endorsed. And the sad part was, and they spent unreal amounts of money. The top vote getter on the Republican side, I hate to bring up politics, but it is the reality, spent $80,000. Normally in a school board race, you don't spend that kind of money. I think the first time when I ran, I maybe spent $6,000. I ended up spending maybe 15,000 second time. And everybody that had been on the board and the other people that were running, all 4 of us lost. And so then the school board had 4 majority of extreme right-wing Republicans that had been endorsed by Moms for Liberty. And all the things that have been reported here happened to our district. Banning of books. I call it the torturing of our LGBTQ kids. They were singled out and particularly had policies and situations done that really made their lives miserable. They kept going after teachers' curriculum, citing CRT. It was just absolutely amazing. Displays on the wall, teachers and student works, they banned that because it might be, this was their opinion was that it might be connected to the Palestinian protests. This was last spring. This went on for the 2 years that I was out. I decided to run again. As I said, I'm an educator, and that's my avocation. It's what I care about the most. I spent my whole life doing it. And actually also I have children. I'm raising my grandkids now. I have custody of them. And I had already had 2 kids in this, 2 kids in the system. So I love our schools. Our schools are strong. It's got wonderful people. And it was breaking my heart to watch him literally chase out some of our best teachers and our administrators because of the stress that we've all gone through. So I ran. And this is the good news. After all this horror, we made national news repeatedly. The people in the community were outraged. The audiences were full. Our call to the audiences, as I said, we had to do limitations, and we had to do not just limitations of lottery. We had law enforcement. All this costs a lot of money, just like everything's been reported in the story. And the good news is I won. But I didn't just win a little. I got more votes in our district, in our local election, than anybody else has historically in any other election in New Hanover County. 1,000 more than the top vote getter for county commissioner. And why? I know why. The people were sick of what was going on. And this is wonderful information that we absolutely need to share. And the thing is when the public comes to a certain point, and this is local politics, all politics are local, and sees they were so outraged. What happened is as the extreme right-wingers started enacting these ridiculous policies that had nothing to do with education, started taking attention from what we needed to be doing in the schools. Our budget started to fall apart because COVID money went away, and we couldn't even get that straight because of all of the crazy things that the school board members were focusing on. At the end of last year, there was a survey taken of our schools, and our school employees, thousands of them, we have 25,000 students. We're a urban suburban district. We're the smallest county in the state, and we've got one of the hardest populations. That survey said that they were disgusted. 85% of our employees were disgusted with our school board. Well, you can imagine what that said about our populace. So that's why I got voted back in. I had been known, I had a reputation of being honest and focusing on the kids and not playing politics. So the votes I got weren't just for Democrats. I got a lot of votes from unaffiliated and a lot from Republicans. And that made a statement. And I think this is where we need to head. Is we need to be focusing on the schools. Now, Another good thing is the makeup of the board now is I've only been on there, it's only been 3 months, but we're working together. That statement rings true. The 3 people that were elected, the other 2, one was another Democrat, the other one was Republican, but more the most moderate one. The other ones was Moms for Liberties. They lost horribly, thank goodness. And so that the people on the board now are paying attention. We still got a couple people that are focused on that, but we are of a much more moderate tone. We have actually got a lot more work done in the last 3 months. We've got a new superintendent who's doing an excellent job. So, things were looking really bad. And you look at national politics right now, things are looking really bad, but we have to also realize that I think people overall really want what's best for our schools. And we just got to get the message out that what's best for our kids is what matters, not all this politics.
So
And it's hard.
let me ask just to clarify, were you not the only candidate that flipped a Moms for Liberty seat? Were there others? Or did the Moms for Liberty, like some of those get reelected? You were talking about how much more moderate the board is now. So tell us more about and you're speaking of the 2024 elections, right?
I'm now speaking because in 22, they got it all. They got all 4 seats. This time they got none. There were 3 people, because it's a different election. There were 3 seats open this time. 2 on the right wing, two Mom for Liberty, heavily. In fact, one of them was the president of the Mom for Liberty. And the third candidate that was on the Republican side is more of a libertarian and more of a moderate. And he's the only one that won of the Republicans. The 2, myself and the other Democrat, won. As I said, we're all more moderate.
Okay.
And so once we got on the board, we managed to elect the chairperson that is Republican that had been on there. That was the most moderate.
Right.
So the most extreme people now no longer have control of the board, and we're all trying to focus. We're working together. We're making a concerted, because it's been horrible the last 2 years. So we've made national news. It was almost impossible to fund the schools. We have lost like hundreds of positions, teachers leaving en masse. For good reason, everything that was described earlier.
That was actually one of my questions, was to ask you about turnover. So thank you for making that point. And if it's okay with you, I'm going to let Dr. Jacobsen, she's got her hand raised. I'm going to let her ask you a question.
Sure.
Thanks, Judy. It's more of a comment. I think you're making some really good points about the way that people can come together. There is a movement, and North Carolina is one of the few states that allows school board members the school board election to be partisan. And last year, 11 states introduced legislation, and there's a push out there to make school board elections partisan. And I would encourage people to really think about what that might do to exactly what you're talking about. So I don't know if you want to comment on that too, but certainly North Carolina is already in a situation where districts could choose to become partisan, but there's a larger movement to make all school board elections partisan.
It's a horrible idea. It leads to a lot of dysfunction. It puts too much politics into the running of the schools. One of the things I have done the last 2 years when I wasn't on the board, I would come into the call to the audience every time. And every time I would tell them, stop playing politics, start focusing on education. And since I knew some of the people up there, and people in the community knew me, they understood I was speaking about what's really important. I have worked years ago when I was still active. I worked in a school district. I'm not going to name it, but it's one of the richest in the state. And it was nonpartisan at the time. I loved it. It functioned so well. Actually, the state of North Carolina before 2010, I hate to be political, but it's a fact. Before 2010, when the Republicans took over the state legislature and started cutting our finances, there was only like 15 school boards out of 115 school districts across the state that were partisan. Once the Republicans took over the state legislature, the district could petition to the state legislature, and if you want to become partisan, they can. We're now almost up to 50%. It's very political. And that does not help our children at all.
Dr. Jacobsen, what's happened in North Carolina, I can speak to this too, is that they've largely left the urban districts, the larger urban districts alone, and those largely remain nonpartisan. It's the small, rural, more right-leaning districts that have gone to partisan elections for school boards. And you can draw whatever conclusion you want to there, but that's where we're at. So, but it does change things, and it really, there's also been, for in Wake County, at least, we used to be on the off cycle. So we did not run in the general election cycle. And you get, there's pros and cons to that, because when you're on the general election cycle, obviously you get more voters. However, when you're on the off cycle, you have a higher chance of getting a more informed voter
Yep.
participating in the down, the local elections. So we have had a lot of change, as Judy pointed out, in the last decade. And I am going to check.
So Judy, we have a question.
Mhm.
Tell me, and our audience, because your presentation has been fascinating. And I really appreciate the way that you've just told the facts, and that's what they are.
Yes.
And that's, yes, sometimes we're Ds and Rs, and that's what it is. But the question that folks have is like, how did you get this information out to the community so effectively, right? Because they did come and they did make different choices when they voted. What was your best strategy? Why do you think it worked for you?
A lot of it has to do with the media, social media, and the attention we were just, this is what the extremists that have this distorted narrative wanted. They wanted attention. Well, they got their attention. The public's, and this is sad, it's become the best show in town. That's a horrible way to look at our school board meetings. But people would tell me that all the time. They go home, watch YouTube, we get thousands of viewers. So it was out there. And so every week, I mean, every month, people saw the disaster. Kids came home, parents were involved. Not enough, if you ask me, there's never enough parents involvement. But the ones that did really were appalled by what they were seeing. They did this to themselves. They really did. What they did is they shined a light on themselves. At first, they were shining a light. During COVID, COVID was so unnatural. It was the oddest situation. They shined a light on their base. They wanted, with all the lies that were going on, they wanted their base to pay attention. And so in 22, which was an off-year election, people were exhausted. Who came out to vote? And I said they raised a ton of funds that we didn't even think to do, because this is a school board election. So they got put in there. They wanted to be in there. They got in there, and the public saw exactly how horrendous that they were leading. They did a horrible job for 2 years. There's no other description.
One question I have you been able to reverse any of the really bad, like you mentioned about the book bans and removing materials from children's artwork or projects from the walls? Have you all been able to reverse any of that?
It's going to take time, but we jumped right into it. We are working with people that need to understand we're not a threat, and what we're doing is trying to do what's best for the kids. A lot of people are still shell shocked from the last 2 years. The ones on the board are, for sure. I think that we all need to give each other some grace and some time and get there. And we already started working on it. You can't just go throw it all against the wall and hope something sticks. It's got to be methodical and
It's really great to
practical.
hear that you all are working well together now, and that you're able to come together and find some common ground. That's really great news for all concerned, right? And most importantly, it's great news for the kids and for the teachers and the administrators. So yeah, I was, again, I apologize for repeating myself, but I was so excited because we watched New Hanover, just as Dr.
Poor
Jacobsen.
things. Seriously.
No, I don't see it that way at all. I mean, at Public Schools First NC, that is our role, is to follow what's happening with public education across the state. And so we were aware of what was going on there. And I was really excited that you were able to come, and share your story. So let's see what other,
A few logistical questions people have had, Lynn, like, how are the board members elected? At large, by district? Is it mixed?
It's at large. I wish it wasn't. Districts would be fairer. In fact, across the country, most school boards are elected by district. But once more, New Hanover, not only has it been partisan since the 1970s, it's also been at large, which made it really hard for a lot of minority populations, lower socioeconomic groups to be able to have representation. I would love to see districts, but no, it is a at-large district.
And another question logistically is, how do you guys handle your public comments? Do you have a certain time? And how many minutes is it? And do you address any of the comments from the board table at any point?
That's a good question. It has stretched out. Originally, when I was on the board, it was like 3 minutes, and we didn't even have a limitation. It got crazy almost immediately, sadly, because of the sexual assault scandals in our district. People started coming in mass, so we had to start make limitation, and then COVID hit, and it got real crazy. Right now, what we have done is we limited it to 2 minutes and 25 speakers, and it usually runs an hour. And we do it before we have we have it early in the meeting time, so that if people have concerns about things that are on the agenda, they can speak before we make decisions. But that's taken a long time to get there with a lot of different permutations. So now it's working well. In fact, this last week they were trying to, some of the more right-wing people still there were trying to change it up and try to put it behind our general information sessions, make it late, you know how that works. And we voted that down. So we're leaving it as it is. It's very fair. As far as questions back, it's just like the presenter said earlier, you wait until the end, and if you have something to say, you can. Although there have been certain times when things were so outrageous, people from the podium did, from the dais did come back at the people on the podium. In fact, we had that happen this week. There was one gentleman that came up, and one of the more right-wing board members tried to question what they were doing. But then one of the other board members stood up for the speaker, and we were able to get that speaker through fairly and in a respectful way. And that's it. We're sort of we're working the culture with the new board. And it's being, but that took a long time to get there. It's taken years. And that 2 years of dysfunction, for lack of a better way of putting it, has caused now for us to realize we've got to do this right if we're going to help our kids.
And how long are your terms?
Yeah, Yvonne, let me share just for context what Wake County does, just to offer a different, I mean, it's not drastically different, but in Wake County, we moved our public comment up to earlier in the meeting, because before board member comments, because we felt like that was the right thing to do, regardless of who's speaking. We just felt like the public comes out, and so we're going to let them go first. We give everyone 3 minutes, and we set aside a half 30 minutes for public comment. And then if we're not done with public comment, we conduct our business, and then we come back to it. So we do try to give, even if we have a whole lot of speakers, we will stay there as late as it takes. As long as they stay, we will also stay to try to, allow everyone to be heard. And Yvonne, I'm sorry I interrupted you. Were you asking about the term limits for New Hanover?
Yeah. How long are your terms, Judy?
4 years.
4 years. Okay. And you have 5 seats?
7.
7 seats. And of course, Wake County, it does run by district, and they are staggered terms. Now they are back to 4 years. And Lynn, there's 9 of you.
Yes, we have a 9-member board, and we're larger, but yeah. Yeah.
Okay. In the last question here that I see is, Judy, it seems like before, you read Dr. Jacobsen's research before she put it out, because it sounds like you're doing a lot of the stuff she's recommending, that you're looking for ways to mediate, you're looking for ways to show respect, you're trying to put some order and how things are going, so that it's not so chaotic, that you're not letting the disruptors, so to speak, control the meeting. So this is really exciting to see that where you started, you could even say 4 or 5 or 6 years ago, and then what happened 2 years ago, and where you are now. And do you feel like the PTAs are getting involved in your support, or how do the PTAs work in your county in terms of being involved in school board issues?
I hate to say this, but practically not at all. They're pretty darn silent. And what they do is they focus on the schools.
Yes.
You have a very divergent types of PTA participation. We have 46 schools in our district, 26 elementary schools, and a huge disparity between the richer schools and the poorer schools. And that's a whole nother discussion right there, because they were resegregated back around 2008, 2010. And it's socioeconomically, it's a mess. I love Wake County, what they did back around the late 90s by breaking that up. And that's something that when originally I ran in 2018, I wanted to focus on. And so you've got PTAs that have got literally $60,000 in the bank, and then PTAs that don't even exist because in the poorer schools. Yeah, they are not a factor as far as what we've been going through the last 6 years. Or for me.
And the question was really focused around using them, Dr. Jacobsen, as is that a way to use PTAs to get your brag stories out, to get your success stories, to share communication and what's going on? I mean, how do we invite PTA leaders into work sessions or discussion sessions and so forth? So Judy, that was the question was framed in that.
Okay.
And there aren't any other questions, but I do want to say, Judy, that you're getting, I'm getting a lot of texts and correspondence that says, God bless Judy Justice.
Been easy. I'm stubborn. It's a good thing.
But I just thought I would share that with you because we all applaud your success, but we also applaud the hopefulness that you're bringing, that maybe there's some way to get around this. So thank you.
You're welcome. And we've always got to do that. We've always literally
All right,
got
I
to
think
do that.
So Yvonne, I'm thrilled that you mentioned PTA, because that is a great segue. It gives me the opportunity to say to our audience that the next webinar that we're going to do, and I'm sorry I don't have the date in front of me or a slide for it, but we are doing a webinar with the North Carolina PTA with Mo Green, North Carolina's Superintendent of Public Instruction. Mo Green, who was just elected in November, is our guest. And again, that's a joint program, free webinar with the North Carolina PTA. We are thrilled to partner with them this year. We did a great campaign for School Choice Week about why public schools are the best choice. And so I hope you'll find that content on social media. What you see in front of you is how you can find us and all the places that you can find us. I want to give a special spotlight to our YouTube channel, because every webinar we've ever done is archived on our YouTube channel, available for free at any time for anyone, not only to watch, but to share. And this one will also be posted. We're usually pretty quick about it. So if it's not posted tomorrow, it'll certainly be posted by Saturday. We have a weekly newsletter. The General Assembly keeps us really busy, and we share that news from the General Assembly in our weekly newsletter. So we encourage you to sign up for that. It is sent to your inbox on Saturdays with a few special additions here and there, like if we need an urgent action item, such as a petition or something like that. But Dr. Jacobsen, oh, I'm sorry, you guys. Anyway. Thank you so much for joining us and for being here. Judy, thank you as well. I think Dr. White had to leave us, but we thank all of you for being here, and have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for letting me join you all.